It was magnificent.
One of his pictures are equivalent to 10 of somebody else's.
Oh, Nicole. And shake his head.
Do you know him? And nobody ever really knew him.
He was known as a kind of future threat.
One of the all-time great motion picture makers.
A future threat to peace and quiet.
Legendary. Meanness.
There were times he drove me crazy.
He was a very lovable individual.
I love him one minute, and the next minute I hate him. I could kill him.
Perhaps the most intelligent person I've ever met.
He got fascinated with Nescafe commercials.
Have you seen the film Groundhog Day?
Because they told stories so fast.
Well, that's what it was like.
This man was born to push the envelope.
There is still a part of Stanley that's a great mystery to me.
And he always pushed the envelope.
And you must expect someone like that to be different from the rest of us.
I think we were too scared of him over here.
Everybody pretty much acknowledges he's the man. And I still feel that underrates him.
This film is about the life and work of Stanley Kubrick, an outstanding filmmaker, one of the great artists of our time. Stanley Kubrick was an enigma to many people. In his films, he was extrovert, challenging, and ready to break conventions. But Kubrick himself was intensely private, shunning publicity, and fiercely guarding his anonymity. Happiest at work and at home with his family and a large circle of friends. He was a chess player in every sense, both cautious and aggressive. He took great risks, but evaluated each move with the greatest of care. Stanley was born in New York and remained a New Yorker all his life, even though he and his family lived in England for nearly 40 years. He died at his home on the 7th of March, 1999. This film will make use of unique material which has never been seen before. It is a document about a man who remained silent whether he was being applauded or damned. Stanley Kubrick was born in New York on the 26th of July, 1928. His father, Jack, was a doctor who married Gertrude Perveller the previous year. His sister Barbara was born 6 years later in 1934.
Today, a lot of people that have kids that are that far apart, they encourage the older one to nurture the younger one as a baby, and so they sort of get to love them. But I gather Stanley was very jealous, that I was there. He was very good, though. He was very good to me.
Nobody ever accuses him of being playful.
Well, he was playful like on the Addams Family, kind of playful. When he was little, I think they did consider him kind of a sissy. Because he wasn't like your typical boy. He read a lot. He always had a book. Well, my mother read all the time. She always was behind him, always. And she really believed it. She says, there's nothing you can't do. And she always was supportive of him. She was really a great mother, I think.
Were they strict? wrote in Jack?
No. Never. He always did what he wanted.
In 1941, when Stanley was 12 years old, he went to Taft High School in the Bronx.
At the beginning, I think, of the second week, Stanley turned to me as the class opened and said, could I let him copy the day's homework? I said, of course, why not? Well, the next day he asked the same thing. And the next day after that, and before I knew it, he was doing it every day, too. So after about a week or 10 days, I finally got up enough aggressiveness to say, Stanley, why aren't you doing your homework? He said to me, very simply, and in what I learned was his characteristic, quiet way, well, I'm not interested. It wasn't as if he were stupid. He was simply not interested and acted upon that.
Stanley was really quite involved, quite passionate about photography. Stanley, you must understand, was, by the general lights of the time, the son of a wealthy person, as they had their own home. And they could have a dark room. And his father was interested in photography, and I think he encouraged Stanley to use the darkroom and to become a photographer. That darkroom background actually was one of the bedrock things that enabled him to develop a very high level of sophistication about photography and then finally cinematography.
Stanley was fascinated by photography. He was the photographer on the school newspaper and was constantly on the lookout for pictures that would capture the imagination.
We interrupt this program to bring you a special news bulletin. A press association has just announced that President Roosevelt is dead.
Roosevelt was a god to us. That's what my mother said. She said, I'm not sure there's a God, when he died. And then when he took that picture, whoa. It just made everybody that saw it would cry. They'd just start to cry. He looked like just the world had ended. And Stanley just got that.
It was this photograph of a news vendor mourning the death of President Roosevelt that transformed the amateur into a professional. Stanley was just 16 when he sold this picture to Look, one of America's great illustrated magazines. When he graduated high school, he joined Look as a staff photographer, taking thousands of pictures, perpetually experimenting and gaining valuable experience for the next stage of his career. Kubrick shot several features on boxing for Look, one on the rising young fighter, Walter Cartier. Passionate about the sport, he realized he had found the subject for his first film.
Day of the Fight was Stanley's first effort at filmmaking. I was his assistant on that. And I'm very proud of the fact that I operated the second camera during the final fight sequence, which is a real fight. And we were alternating with each other. I was shooting when he was loading. I got the knockdown because Stanley was loading.
He's done it. He's KO'd Bobby Jane. This is a fighter, Walter Cartier. He's just moved up one more place in a line that may end with a championship.
Following Day of the Fight, Kubrick quit his job at Look and devoted himself to making films. He moved to Greenwich Village and for the next few years supported himself by making short documentaries, hustling chess in Washington Square, and playing tournaments for prize money. But chess winnings were never going to be enough to fund an entire film. So in 1953, Kubrick's father cashed in his life insurance to help his son make Fear and Desire, a film about a fictitious war. It was Kubrick's first feature.
She'll see us. Shut up.
He was absolutely and totally involved in the making of this movie. He knew nothing about acting. I probably didn't know much more. He was not a bohemian. He was not an avant-garde left bank figure. He was a kid from the Bronx who was smart. I don't think he had too much education. He was a very good chess player. It's the intensity impressed me. I thought he had a vision of someplace he was going.
Fear and Desire was a youthful apprentice exercise. Kubrick would later withdraw the film from circulation, but he got him noticed and helped to get him financial backing for his next feature. Killer's Kiss revealed Kubrick's extraordinary ability to play with light.
Brings together two very game boys. The youngster, undefeated.
Stanley was making his second film, and I wanted very much to be the still photographer. So I also wanted to see somebody discovering, somebody learning. I knew I'd be seeing that. This was Stanley at a point where he had no physical resources at all. On Fridays, he dismissed the company for a couple of hours, went to the unemployment line and collected his unemployment check, because that's what he was living on. It was $30 a week, and he just about made it.
He was very ambitious, and he knew that this was going to help him, because once there was a scene in the morning, and the crew wasn't being paid much either, and everybody was in a bad mood, and Stanley said, well, why don't we just take the afternoon off? So I was amazed. Going to give us the day off. But he always drove me home. So on the ride home, I said, why are you always so nice to everyone? He said, honey, nobody's going to get anything out of this movie but me.
The theatrical release of Killer's Kiss brought Kubrick to the attention of James Harris, an up-and-coming producer who had access to finance. They teamed up to form Harris Kubrick Pictures.
The only thing is, we didn't have anything to do at that time. We had no subject to deal with. So that night, I left the office and went to a bookstore and found a book there about the robbery of a racetrack.
I don't suppose there's anything for dinner.
Well, of course there is, darling. There are all sorts of things. We have steak and asparagus and potatoes.
I don't smell nothing.
Well, that figures, because you're too far away from it.
Too far away from it?
Certainly you don't think I had it all cooked, do you? It's all down in the shopping center.
I thought he was a kid. Both he and Jim were so very young. I'm guessing, but I think Stanley was only 26 at the time. I don't think anything was difficult for Stanley. He had this tremendous confidence. And if he hadn't, I don't think he could have worked with Lucien Ballard as he had.
The cameraman was Lucien Ballard. And Lucien had, I believe, won an Academy Award, was regarded as one of the top dozen or so photographers in the business, and was a particularly stylish fellow. Married to Merle Oberon, a classic example of the old-style cinematographer.
Stanley really had done his own photography on the two films that he had done previously, so he knew exactly what he wanted. And I think that Lucien Ballard kind of resented this young fellow from New York.
The first shot of the picture, first day, first shot, Stanley set up a shot. It was quite complex. It was a long dolly shot, and he's lined it up specifically with a 25mm lens. And he set it up and turned it over to Lucien, and Lucien said, fine, and began the elaborate business of lighting and setting a dolly track and so on. And Stanley went over to talk to Jimmy or do something, and looked back sort of over his shoulder and noticed that the dolly track was much further away from where he had set the camera. He said to Lucien, what are you doing, Lucien? I put the camera here. You're pulling it way back. Why haven't you put it where I've asked for it? He said, well, I haven't changed anything. I'm using a 50mm lens to give you precisely the same coverage that you've asked for, but it's with the 50. And I've used the 50 because it makes my job a lot easier and it'll go a lot faster. And Stanley listened to this and said, but what about the change in perspective that occurs? He said, well, that really doesn't matter that much. That particular piece of information, of course, is dead wrong. The perspective changes. It's a different shot. And Stanley was aware that Lucien was simply bullying past him, but also what particularly nettled him was the assumption that he wouldn't understand this or wouldn't care about it. And Stanley said, put the camera where I told you, with the lens that I asked for, or get off the set and don't come back. Said it very quietly, very softly, and there was a look between them, and Lucien changed the setup and moved the camera where it had to be, and there was never an argument again about anything.
All right. Check it through.
Passengers
Thank you,
may
sir.
now
I'm sure you'll
board
find this service to your complete
American Airlines
satisfaction.
Flight 40, the New Englander.
I suppose that a lot of what Stanley is and what he in more complicated ways did with later films is implicit in that rather simple little movie about this meticulously planned crime. This sense that the Sterling Hayden character has that he's really on top of that. He really knows what he's doing. And the fact that at the end of the movie, the little yapping dog gets loose and the prop wash goes and the money blows all over the place. I mean, it's sort of a brilliant movie, and it is an existential movie. I mean, that is to say, if existentialism basically posits that we define ourselves by doing, and the chance is the one thing we can never quite fully comprehend prior to its impinging on our desires or our plans or whatever it is. It's a brilliant statement of that.
The Killing was not a commercial success, but the ingenious caper story did succeed in building Kubrick and Harris's reputation.
When I saw The Killing, I said, my God, Stanley's going to make it. This is good. But it's Paths of Glory that turned it all around.
We walked in the middle, as we usually did when we were kids, in the middle of a movie, Paths of Glory. And myself and my friends who were kind of war film buffs, we had never seen anything quite like it. We never seen anything quite like the tone of it. We had seen other anti-war films, but this one was so honest, particularly the trial scene and the scenes between McCready and Kirk Douglas.
I ordered an attack. Your troops refused to attack.
Our troops did attack, sir, but they could make no headway.
Because they didn't try, Colonel. I saw it myself. Half of your men never left the trenches.
A third of my men were pinned down because the fire was so intense.
Don't quibble over fractions, Colonel. The fact remains that a good part of your men never left their own trenches. Colonel Dax, I'm going to have 10 men from each company in your regiment tried under penalty of death for cowardice.
Penalty of death?
For cowardice! They've skimmed milk in their veins instead of blood.
Well, that's the reddest milk I've ever seen. My trenches are soaked.
That's just about enough out of you,
I'm not going to mince words and stand on
Colonel
protocol
Dax,
when
if
the
you
lives
continue in this manner, I shall have to place you under arrest.
It was so honest that it was shocking. And what, made it even more shocking was the nature of the way it was shot. The use of the tracking camera in the trenches. There's something about an objective vision that's happening. They're trying to be objective to just show you, hey, I'm just showing you this, man. You make up your own mind, but I'm telling you right now, this is what went down, and it's bad, and it's a lie, it's hypocrisy.
Maybe the attack against the anthill was impossible. Perhaps it was an error of judgment on our part. On the other hand, if your men had been a little more daring, they might have taken it. Who knows? In any case, why should we have to bear any more criticism and failure than we have to? Aside from the inescapable fact that a good many of your men never left the trenches, there's the question of the troops' morale. Don't forget that.
The troops' morale?
Certainly. These executions will be a perfect tonic for the entire division. There are few things more fundamentally encouraging and stimulating than seeing someone else die.
Many artists, when they put a canvas up, which is blank, they start with very detailed pencil strokes, very small, delicate pencil strokes on a canvas. Stanley started conceptually in all of his movies, from my point of view, with large, primary colored brush strokes. And he would just like beat out these concepts that were, you know, pretty obvious. When you look at Paths of Glory, every sequence hammers its points home, but within every sequence, the filmmaking is delicate and subtle and gentle almost.
I guess what really hit us was the end of the film. There's a tendency when you want to get to that kind of emotion or that level of sentiment, not sentimentality, but sentiment, and just portray this aspect of humanity. Very often, you know, you fall into sentimentality. You really do, and it's very, very hard. It's very hard to pull off. This one works like you cannot see it without weeping.
Und als man ihm die Botschaft bracht, dass sein Herzliebchen im Sterben lag, da ließ all sein Hab und Gut und eilte seinem Herzliebchen.
He was sitting behind his desk for this interview I was to have, because he was looking for an actress for that scene in Paths of Glory. And you know, I thought he looked extraordinary. And he just sat there, beaming at me, grinning at me throughout the interview. And I must have grinned back. And he's been smiling at me for 43 years afterwards.
Following Paths of Glory, Christiana and her 3-year-old daughter, Katharina, moved with Stanley to Los Angeles. Stanley and Christiana were married in 1958, and Hollywood would be their home for the next few years, where they were to have 2 more children, Anya and Vivian. For its damning portrayal of the French officer class, Paths of Glory would be banned in France for nearly 20 years. But the film brought its director firmly to the attention of Hollywood. He was still only 28.
This is Stanley Kubrick. I think that if the reigning powers had any great respect for good pictures or the people who could make them, that this respect was probably very well tempered by the somewhat cynical observation that poor and mediocre pictures might just as well prove successful as their pictures of higher value. Television has changed this completely, and I think that despite the unhappy financial upheaval that it has caused in the movie industry, it has also provided a very invigorating and stimulating challenge, which has made it necessary for films to be made with more sincerity and more daring. If Hollywood lacks the color and excitement of its early days, with Rolls Royces and leopard skin seat covers, I think, on the other hand, it provides the most exciting and stimulating atmosphere of opportunity and possibilities for young people today.
Slaves, you have arrived at the gladiatorial school of Lentulus Batiatus. Here you will be trained by experts to fight in pairs to the death. Obviously, you won't be required to fight to the death here. That'll only be after you've been sold. And then for ladies and gentlemen of quality, those who appreciate a fine kill. The gladiators, like a stallion, must be pampered. You'll be oiled, bathed, shaved, massaged, taught to use your heads. A good body with a dull brain is as cheap as life itself. I congratulate you, and may fortune smile on most of you.
Then Kirk Douglas came to us and was having trouble with Spartacus and had shot for 3 days and wanted to replace the director who was doing the film and asked if Stanley could be acquired sort of on a loan-out basis. We thought it would be good for Stanley's career and for our company. Stanley, I thought, did an incredible job of taking that film, which the script didn't even have battle sequences in it, and sort of did some recasting of some of the parts, took some of the film to Spain and did the big battle scenes, and turned it into a marvelous epic film.
I was rather dreading the arrival of Stanley. I knew nothing about him, but I had seen Paths of Glory, which I find one of the best films I've ever seen.
In spite of your vices, you are the most generous Roman of our time.
Vices?
Ladies.
Ladies, since when are they a vice?
So I had a very high opinion of him, but I also had a great affection for Tony Mann. And Tony Mann directed the early parts of the film, the ones in Death Valley. I think probably the studio wanted the reassurance of an older, more routine man. And Kirk always had the idea of wanting Stanley. So it was a very difficult task for him because we all had different acting styles. Olivier and Lawton hated each other. It was like two dogs.
I'll take a little Republican corruption along with a little Republican freedom, but I won't take the dictatorship of Crassus and no freedom at all. That's what he's out for, and that's why he'll be back.
And I look back now, I think he was 30 years old when he did it. Yeah, working with Olivier, Charles Lawton, and he was fearless.
If he was terrified, he didn't show it because he knew he mustn't. I think he had an extraordinary ability to concentrate on what is important. He did not allow himself to be sidetracked. And even if it was emotional turmoil and great worry, he wouldn't, that perhaps is a chess playing thing, he wouldn't allow it to influence him. And I think that very soon the actors noticed, oh, yeah, they were quite safe.
Traveled a long ways together. Fought many battles. Won great victories. Now, instead of taking ship for our homes across the sea, we must fight again. Maybe there's no peace in this world. For us or for anyone else, I don't know. But I do know that as long as we live, we must stay true to ourselves.
Its great virtue was it was the only film that kind that didn't have Jesus in it. There was no trace of Christianity in Spartacus, really. There was faith, but not Christianity. Kirk wants to be rewarded for his courage, which I would certainly be the first to do so. To make a film like that without Jesus, but with Kubrick, is already a tremendous achievement.
But I think they were both fairly temperamental. Neither of them would give an inch. So there was tension. But he was uncomfortable during the making of that film, but not necessarily because of Kirk alone. It's because he had no rights over the script. He had all those things he got used to and fought for having. He didn't have. He had no say.
Stanley was unhappy because he was dealing with the star, who was also the producer and in charge of the production. And there were certain instances where he felt that things should be done differently, but because Kirk was in charge, they were done Kirk's way. And I'm not saying that Kirk was wrong or right, but nevertheless, Stanley said, from now on, I want to do pictures where I really have final cut.
The first overseas premiere of UI's screen epic Spartacus is the most brilliant event on London's show business calendar for the year. Director Stanley Kubrick and UI...
Spartacus was a critical and commercial success, winning 4 Oscars. Despite Kubrick's youth, he was now a recognized Hollywood director. But the process had also taught him that he had to have full control over his films.
I had a feeling that during Spartacus he was biding his time, getting on the record as the director of a big and successful film which would give him greater freedom in the future. And he did turn his career into that of an artist, whereas it could quite easily, had he surrendered at any juncture, have been that of a very successful journeyman.
He felt now he had this label, I'm a film director, officially. Now I can make a story that I have a crush on.
The interpretation of the image, where to place the camera, the nature of, the nature of the subject matter, which at that time, everything was opening up in the early 60s here in America, and it was scandalous.
Put your head back. Put your head back. Open your mouth. You can have one little bite.
I think what a lot of people forget is just what a hot book Lolita was. Originally, Nabokov couldn't get a publisher in the States or in the United Kingdom. So it was published as a dirty book in Paris. And it was in 1955 that Graham Greene in the Sunday Times in London nominated it as his novel of the year. It then took off, and it very soon found a publisher.
He thought Lolita was a fantastic book because it clarified the feeling we all have that good and evil does not come in the expected package.
Well, I guess I won't be seeing you again, huh?
I shall be moving on. I must prepare for my work at Beardsley College in the fall.
Then I guess this is goodbye.
Yes.
Don't forget me.
What always shocks me when people say that Stanley didn't make people movies or movies about characters. He made movies about machines or it's always confounded me when I've heard that. Lolita is, it's nothing like the book, but he did draft the author to write the screenplay. So they were, in collaboration with each other in another kind of version away from the novel that is much more about the human condition than I felt the novel ever was.
Lolita works as the very first Stanley Kubrick film for me, because I couldn't imagine anybody else making Lolita. It's a comedy, but it's got a lot of serious elements. It's risque. It's in your face. It's got big performances, and it works completely.
You're a disgusting, despicable, loathsome criminal fraud!
Don't do that.
Get out of my way. Get out of my way.
No,
I'm
I want
getting
to
out of here. Go on. Get out of my way. I'm leaving here today. You can have all of it. But you are never going to see that miserable brat again!
At a time when American cinema in the early 60s was on the way down. In other words, the studio system was finishing. This was a vision. This was somebody with authority making you look a certain way at things.
When I stood Adam naked, Adam naked, you should be ashamed of yourself, Captain. Before a federal law and all its stinging stars. Tarnation, you old horn-toad, that's mighty pretty. That's a pretty poem. Because you took advantage. It's getting a bit repetitious, isn't it? Because, another one, because you cheated me. Because you took her at an age when young lads... That's enough. Say, what'd you take it away for, mister? That's getting kind of smutty there.
Because of its scandalous theme, the film had a crippling distribution problem.
The Catholic Church had their own censorship, and that if they condemned your film, they would then send notices to their churches, the Catholic churches all over the country, that it would be sinful to see this film.
You just touch me and I go as limp as a noodle. It scares me.
Yes, I know the feeling.
That held up the film for about 6 months because they did condemn it. There was a picture of Lolita on the bedside stand. So when Humbert and his wife Charlotte were in bed, they felt that Humbert was using the picture for sexual stimulation. I denied that. I think that in all fairness, they were right. Anyway, we agreed to limit the number of looks at that picture.
To get a release, Kubrick had to recut Lolita. As he later told Newsweek, had I known how severe the limitations were going to be, I probably wouldn't have made the film.
There is acclaim in the film world for Stanley Kubrick, director of Lolita, arriving with Mrs. Kubrick.
Lolita's strong performance at the box office was, no doubt, boosted by the controversy. Kubrick's next film would prove even more controversial.
Now then, Dmitri, you know how we've always talked about the possibility of something going wrong with the bomb. The bomb, Dmitri. The hydrogen bomb.
Everything wonderful about that movie is because of the way it was directed. Otherwise, you know, I thought there were flaws in the writing of the movie and flaws in some of the performances in the movie, but the directing of the movie was so bravura and so superb that it just, you know, was just a knockout.
The vision of just the opening credits and the use of music over the opening credits, we knew immediately anything could happen in this movie.
People remember the film because it deals with one of the most dark things of the post-war period. The idea, you know, that hanging over us was nuclear oblivion, that this was the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis. I mean, and it can't have possibly got closer than those few days where one mistake by either side could have started the World War III, quite literally. This piece of satire just hit it right on the button, and it was frightening. Very, very frightening.
Well, now, what happened is one of our base commanders, he had a sort of, well, he went a little funny in the head. You know, just a little funny. And he went and did a silly thing. Well, I'll tell you what he did. He ordered his planes to attack your country. Well, let me finish, Dmitri. Let me finish, Dmitri. Well, listen, how do you think I feel about it?
He was able to say what we all knew about the madness of it. He had bought the book and was trying to make it straight and realized that he couldn't, that it was so utterly insane that it couldn't be done that way. And what he did was say that this is insane. I mean, please, who are we kidding?
Gentlemen, you can't fight in here. This is the war room.
And it ever after made it very difficult to take seriously the Strategic Air Command. I mean, they seemed like they were nuts from then on, and I think they probably were.
The most extraordinary part of Dr. Strangelove for me was that 30 years on, as part of a BBC team, I investigated over a period of like 2 years many of the central tenets in the film, what had happened in reality, what had happened to Strategic Air Command in the 50s and 60s. And the various elements of the film, like the idea that the military would take command against the president and use nuclear weapons without consulting him.
I was under the impression that I was the only one in authority to order the use of nuclear weapons.
That's right, sir. You are the only person authorized to do so. And although I hate to judge before all the facts are in, it's beginning to look like General Ripper exceeded his authority.
Were all, you know, seen as appalling when that film came out. Now we know that many of those elements were absolutely smack on. You know, Curtis LeMay, he actually did a test run to see whether you could provoke the Russians into war. We talked to senior officers who'd worked for LeMay's successor, this is General Tommy Power, and they said this guy was basically psychotic. You know, this has not come out for 30 years, but there it is, right in the core of Strangelove.
Tell me, Jack, when did you first develop this theory?
Well,
I first became aware of it, Mandrake, during the physical act of love.
Huh.
Yes, a profound sense of fatigue, a feeling of emptiness followed. Luckily, I was able to interpret these feelings correctly. Loss of essence.
Huh.
I can assure you it has not recurred, Mandrake. Women sense my power, and they seek the life essence. I do not avoid women, Mandrake.
Yeah.
But I do deny them my essence.
Yes. The other films that were being made at the time about these themes, about the idea of nuclear war, a military takeover in the USA, films like Failsafe and 7 Days in May, they're very naturalistic and rather turgid films. They have no longevity, they don't endure. They're not films that you would watch for any reason except out of sociological interest. But people will watch Dr. Strangelove over and over again because it is so funny. And that was the genius of Kubrick, but also of his collaborators. I mean, he had the massive fortune to be working with two of the funniest people who have ever been involved in the film industry, Terry Southern and Peter Sellers.
What's happened, you see? The string in my leg's gone.
The what?
And the string. I never told you, but you see, got a gammy leg. Oh, dear. Gone, shot off.
Stanley was his best audience. In fact, he spent many of the scenes just being an audience, not a director at all. He would simply put cameras everywhere he could, so that when Peter was off, flying high, Stanley says, "I don't want anything to be lost." And he would just lie on his back, you know, roaring with laughter. That egged Peter on to ever greater heights.
Also, when they go down into the mine, everyone will still be alive. There will be no shocking memories. And the prevailing motion will be one of nostalgia for those left behind, combined with a spirit of bold curiosity for the adventure ahead.
One of the great things about his films is the scrupulous detail in which everything is, you know, and that's part of the power of it, the detail in Dr. Strangelove. You know, you would think that he had lived through that experience.
Survival kit contents check. In them you'll find 145 caliber automatic, 2 boxes of ammunition, 4 days concentrated emergency rations, 1 drug issue containing antibiotics, morphine, vitamin pills, pep pills, sleeping pills, tranquilizer pills, 1 miniature combination Russian phrase book and Bible.
While we were shooting, somebody had invited some American service personnel to come to Shepperton. They were terrified by the amount of accuracy we had in this aircraft. And the next day I got a memo from Stanley saying, you better make sure that you know where all your references came from, because otherwise we might be investigated by the FBI and so on. I discovered very quickly that behind this boyish enthusiasm and apparent naivete, there was this super brain and enormous power and utter dedication to movie making. You know, it was quite demoralizing at times when he changed his mind. But every time he did change his mind, it was for the better. But I learned a great deal on that film.
Sir, I have a plan. Monsieur, I can walk!
We'll meet again. Don't know where. Don't know where.
I was kind of shocked by it at first. It was so irreverent. And it was a time, it was the height of the Cold War. You know, I was at NYU at the time, But still, my friends in the neighborhood that I saw the film with were somewhere at a Jesuit college called Fordham. Others were street kids. We all went up there to see this movie. They all loved it. And they were extremely conservative. The word on the street was, it's great.
I had a kind of a giddy exhilaration at the end when she was singing, "We'll meet again, don't know where, don't know when," and he's riding the bomb. I thought, man, what kind of an imagination came up with this?
Dr. Strangelove caused uproar. Younger audiences loved its irreverence and anarchic humor, but many people saw it as dangerously subversive.
I remember reading a review in a Beverly Hills paper where the critic said that Stanley Kubrick should be physically harmed for having made that picture. That's a pretty bad review, I must say.
I can't remember any Stanley Kubrick movie that was released where there wasn't controversy. 2001, I remember very well. I remember Pauline Kael's review of 2001. They were not good reviews. And then 10 years goes by, and they're all classics.
By that time, I knew that Kubrick was the one, meaning that, yes, all these extraordinary directors around the world were making film after film, but there was something, after you saw Lolita and Dr. Strangelove, I knew that Kubrick, we had to wait for a Kubrick film. And we knew that when we went to see it, that it was extremely special and that we expected a lot from it, quite honestly. And in 2001, we got it.
By 1963, Stanley Kubrick had established so high a reputation that he could pick his next project without bowing to the dictates of Hollywood. As a director whose films were both popular and critically acclaimed, he had won an astonishing degree of creative independence. Stanley Kubrick now began work on a film which would establish him as one of the great film directors. With 2001: A Space Odyssey, the boy from the Bronx would write a new chapter in cinema history. In the early 1960s, the age of space exploration began when both Russia and America sent men outside the Earth's atmosphere for the first time. As the space race came to dominate the popular imagination, Stanley Kubrick captured the spirit of the times by collaborating on film with the science fiction writer Arthur C. Clarke.
Behind everyone alive today stand 30 ghosts, for that is the ratio by which the dead outnumber the living. Since the dawn of time, about 100 billion human beings have walked on this planet. Now, 100 billion is about the number of stars in our Milky Way galaxy. So this means that for everyone who's ever lived, there could be a star. But of course, stars are suns with planets circling around them. So isn't it an interesting thought that there's enough land in the sky for everyone to have a whole world? We don't know how many of those worlds are inhabited and by what kind of creatures. But one day we should know, perhaps by radio, perhaps by other means, perhaps by direct contact. The impact of that on the human race will be profound, especially if we encounter creatures far in advance of our own rather primitive species. Well, it's a wonderful thing to look forward to, and perhaps a terrifying one. It may happen in our lifetimes, it may not happen for 1,000 years, but one day we will know the truth about this incredible and wonderful universe around us, and perhaps understand our own place in it.
The extraordinary audacity, but also power and I think guts to say, let's just screech everything to a halt, take everybody back to prehistoric times where it wasn't that fast. Considering the way the world was moving so quickly at the time, this just said, no, I want you to see something. I'm going to take you through something you never thought you'd ever experience.
his way of making a film was to concentrate on 7 or 8, as he called them, non-submersible units. And what this meant was you had a very good chunk, you had another good chunk, and when you had got 6 good chunks, you were almost home with a movie. It would be easy to connect them. And you can see this principle operating, in particular in 2001, where I believe that the bits don't quite fit on. And this is why there's a mystery about 2001. It's what still interests people.
I just remember going to the theater and seeing the picture for the first time and feeling that it wasn't a movie. It was the first time that the motion picture form had been changed. It wasn't a documentary, and it wasn't a drama, and it wasn't really science fiction. It was more science eventuality.
Hal, despite your enormous intellect, are you ever frustrated by your dependence on people to carry out actions?
Not in the slightest bit. I enjoy working with people. I have a stimulating relationship with Dr. Poole and Dr. Bowman. My mission responsibilities range over the entire operation of the ship, so I am constantly occupied. I am putting myself to the fullest possible use, which is all I think that any conscious entity can ever hope to do.
Unlike many a science fiction writer, including, I must say, myself, he regarded the future as unknowable. And this is the first movie, the first work of science fiction that actually, I think, depicts the future as unknowable.
18 months ago, the first evidence of intelligent life off the Earth was discovered. It was buried 40 feet below the lunar surface, near the crater Tycho. Except for a single, very powerful radio emission aimed at Jupiter, the 4-million-year-old black monolith has remained completely inert. Its origin and purpose, still a total mystery.
I respect and awe, I'm in awe of the mystery of the universe, something which Einstein's, often said, that anyone who isn't awed by the universe, well, they haven't any soul. So from my earliest days, the wonder of space and time has intrigued me, and Stanley and I tried to put some of this feeling into the film. I think it made people realize that we were a rather small part of an enormous universe. It's hard to realize that when we made that film, we didn't know what the Earth looked like from space, from any real distance. All these things had to be imagined.
The special effects in 2001 were a quantum leap forward for the film industry. These looked the real thing. Stanley had very firm and very specific ideas about how these models were to be lit. The painstaking attention to detail, the coloration, the dirtying up of the models. I mean, this really hadn't been seen before.
One of the best examples for my contribution to the film is what's known as the slit scan sequence, the Stargate sequence. There was a lot of evolution to that concept of how you would be transported from one dimension to another. Was never really solved in the screenplay. And I had remembered, but knowing of an experimental filmmaker who was exploring this whole idea of long time exposures, and while the camera shutter is open, he would move various kinds of artwork or slits around in front of the camera to scan color blocks and objects onto the film in a rather unusual way. And I thought, well, if you took what he was doing, which was kind of flat and two-dimensional, and made it three-dimensional in the z-axis, that you could create this streak exposure. And the streak exposure is like a time exposure of car headlights on the freeway. If you leave the camera shutter open, a car headlight becomes a streak of light. It occurred to me that there might be some way to apply that to the Stargate sequence. And I walked that minute down to Stanley's office. Stanley, I think this is the answer to the Stargate. And he looked at it and he said, I think you could be right. And he said, just do whatever you need to do. You have carte blanche to do it. And that's an example of my whole experience on 2001 was support from Stanley to explore, experiment, take risks, and produce something that was different.
If you can imagine a giant Ferris wheel, and if you were to cover the Ferris wheel with a skin, on the inside edge of that skin, imagine the set being built, and imagine an endless hallway with things along the side. Well, that revolved. There's a scene where I come down a ladder, and the other astronaut, Gary Lockwood, is eating, apparently upside down because he's on the other side of the centrifuge. And it looks like I walk upside down to him. How that actually was done was that Gary had a hidden harness. He was upside down, so I came in right side up, and they just revolved Gary down to me, and I just walked in place.
And there was this theme of constant rotating, rotating, rotating. The space station is rotating, the spacecraft is rotating, the Earth is rotating, everything's in orbit. And that established a style of intercuttable shots that ultimately later lent itself in Stanley's mind to the Strauss waltz.
I always think the history of the cinema divides into two essential eras, before Stanley Kubrick and after Stanley Kubrick, especially in relation to the use of music in films. Before Stanley Kubrick, music tended to be used in films as either decorative or as heightening emotions. After Stanley Kubrick, because of his use of classical music in particular, it became absolutely an essential part of the narrative, intellectual drive of the film. In the use of Ligeti's music, I actually knew that piece of Ligeti, and I remember seeing 2001 and thinking, I'm hearing things. This can't possibly be Ligeti in a Hollywood film, but sure enough it was. And of course, it makes the sequence utterly unforgettable.
It was for me, especially the visual fantasy with the speed, with the color and light changes when the spaceship goes down on a moon of the Jupiter, yeah? And then the speed is more and more and more, and it was very clear that Dr. Einstein pretended that the light velocity is the highest, you cannot go beyond, but in this film it was suggested as if it would be beyond the speed of light, and then we enter in another world.
I never know whether the images arose out of the music or the music arose out of the images. But perhaps the true thing to say is that they became, in his imagination clearly, and so have become in ours, totally inseparable.
When 2001 opened, like previous films of Kubrick's, it split both the critics and the audience.
The opening of 2001 was very frightening because we had all the executives sitting in the audience, very old, many of them, and they didn't understand the film at all and left, whole rows of them, and we were panic-stricken. Then there was an enormous, catastrophic meeting in our hotel room, and Stanley was so upset he lost his voice. We were up all night. Next morning we went to this house, and Stanley was battling on in New York, and I sort of fell with clutching my handbag across my bed asleep because I hadn't slept all night, and woke up to the sounds of a DJ saying, "This is the most fantastic film," and the people are queuing around the block, and he was talking about 2001. And I was desperately trying to ring Stanley to tell him, some people like it enormously. You know, it was just the Blue Rinse Brigade that walked out.
He told me that the first exhibitor screening of 2001 had, I believe he said, 241 walkouts. You know, this is, I'm sure he counted them too.
When I first saw 2001, I didn't like it, and I was very disappointed. And then 3 or 4 months later, I was with some woman in California, and she was telling me what a wonderful film it was, and I went to see it again, and I liked it a lot more the second time I saw it. And then a couple of years later, I saw it again, and I thought, gee, this is really a sensational movie. And it was one of the few times in my life that I realized that the artist was much ahead of me.
A lot of people didn't get it the first time round, and I'm really fond of quoting the MGM executive who said, well, that's the end of Stanley Kubrick. But I think now the message has got over, even though we didn't intend a message specifically. More, you know, Stanley wanted to create an experience. And if any message, perhaps people will get different messages from it according to their own individual philosophies and outlooks.
2001 received a National Catholic Award for its imaginative vision of man's creative encounter with the universe. Some turnaround for Kubrick, who had so upset the Catholic Legion of Decency with Lolita. 2001 also won an Academy Award for Best Visual Effects. As the film's director and designer, Kubrick received his only ever Oscar.
It was that kind of process of personally taking possession of not only the people, the technology, the art, the craft of making movies. He was it. He embodied the whole thing, and he invited actors, cinematographers, production designers to come into his family and collaborate with him, which for some people was difficult. After working with Stanley in 2001, I swore I would never work for anybody again, because Stanley was a hell of a taskmaster. He was difficult, he was demanding, his level of quality control was just astronomically near perfection, and I found as a young guy this was very hard. His mind was so insatiable and so active that he could barely sleep, he could barely stop. I saw that Stanley Kubrick worked and lived his work 7 days a week, almost 24 hours a day. And I think probably he had a hard time keeping up with his own intellect.
Kubrick now turned to a mighty historical character whose triumphs, failures, and personality had always fascinated him. Napoleon.
Napoleon is still in his grave, waiting to be brought back to life. I wonder what Napoleon would think of Lou Wasserman and David Picker. Whether he would like to have them passing judgment on his life.
Napoleon represented for him the worldly genius that at the same time failed. And Stanley was fascinated by the fact that somebody so intelligent and so talented could make such mistakes.
He liked comparing war and chess and making films, and the idea of seeing everything as a battle.
All directors like battle analogies for movies, and certainly nobody planned with the mixed results. When somebody that meticulous plans something, anything that goes wrong seems to wreak havoc.
If Stanley was afraid of anything, it was of making these kind of mistakes, whereby you get carried away without checking thoroughly. There was a chess player in him. You could say maybe that's why he took so long between films. The Napoleon project was well prepared. We were ready to go to Romania, where we could have 5,000 pieces of cavalry, including all the men and commanding officers. And we had paper uniforms and everything ready. And then came this film, Waterloo. It was a very well-made film with Rod Steiger, but for some reason it failed at the box office, and our backers got scared and pulled out.
By 1969, the Kubrick family was living close to the film studios in Elstree, Hertfordshire.
He's always liked living here. There were moments where he was homesick for New York, but he was aware that that was a New York that no longer existed. I don't know, when you brought up your children here and all your children's friends live here and, you know, get attached.
Do you know what kind of a camera that is? What it's called?
It's a home movie.
Araflex, it's called.
I watched the video of me as a very fresh 10-year-old, being very fresh to him, but also him being bossy and too impatient and putting his director's hat on in an inappropriate way.
Get him off on me. Anya, get him off. We're shooting. Grab him and get him off.
And even as a child, I remember thinking, I'm sure you're not supposed to talk to me like this.
Do you often find me in a temper?
Yes.
Oh, I don't believe that. I can't believe that.
Well, you better believe it because you just went in a temper a couple minutes ago. Yeah, because you can't do a stupid film because everyone giggles. And because then I can't play like that.
I think I'm one of the most even-tempered people you'll ever meet.
Kubrick had found privacy and tranquility in England. But this idyllic world was about to be torn apart by his next project, an adaptation of Anthony Burgess's controversial novel, A Clockwork Orange.
There are certain parts that you have in a career that nobody else can play, that you are born to play. That is one of the parts.
There was me, that is Alex, and my three droogs, that is Pete, Georgie, and Dim. And we sat in the Korova milk bar trying to make up our razoo dogs what to do with the evening. The Korova milk bar sold Milk Plus Velocet, or Synthamesque, or Drencrum, which is what we were drinking. This would sharpen you up and make you ready for a bit of the old ultra-violence.
But I remember saying to him once, well, look, Stanley, look, how do you direct? I mean, what's your style? And he said, I really don't know. I never know what I want, but I do know what I don't want. I don't think I've really ever had that much fun on a job. I mean, I've worked with other great directors and certainly Lindsay Anderson, but actually the actual fun of doing the work, which was, of course, in the character of Alex, too. He was a wicked son of a bitch. But the great thing that I think Stanley and I had in common is a wicked sense of humor.
It was my rabbit to help the prison Charlie with the Sunday service. He was a bolshy, great, burly bastard, but he was very fond of myself, me being very young, and also now very interested in the big book. I didn't so much like the latter part of the book, which is more like all preachy talking than fighting and the old in-out. I like the parts where these old Yehudis tolchok each other and then drink their Hebrew vino, and getting onto the bed with their wives' handmaidens. That kept me going.
He explored these extreme subjects that you kind of sometimes wanted to recoil from, like in Clockwork Orange. But they were explored in a way that was dissecting them, truly dissecting them to try to find out what makes that kind of evil tick. And I think that there was a search behind all of those films to say, in a way, in a world where we know man is capable of the most base, shockingly destructive behavior, is hope and virtue possible?
Oh, go on! Do me in, you bastard cowards! We don't want to live anyway. Not in a stinking world like this.
Oh? And what's so stinking about it?
What sort of a world is it at all? Men on the moon, and men spinning around the earth, and there's not no attention paid to earthly law and order no more. Oh, dear little land, I fought for thee, and
You'd have to say that you know, Stanley's view of human nature was, you know, really very, very bleak. It's fairly miraculous in this day and age in particular to have pursued the kind of career he pursued and making these uncompromising movies.
It had been a wonderful evening, and what I needed now to give it the perfect ending was a bit of the old Ludwig van.
In a way, Kubrick's playing around, in the sense of the music, with what he'd done previously. Having taken like a real classical music score for his previous film, now he's saying, okay, well, we're going to have Beethoven, but we're also going to have the William Tell Overture played 5 times too fast. Kubrick's being playful in the same way as when Alex visits the record store, there in the record rack is a copy of 2001, which is obviously a great joke, but also he's also talking about a film director who has given up being influenced by others, a film director whose primary influence has become himself.
For now it was lovely music that came to my aid. There was a window open with a stereo on, and I viddied right at once what to do.
I did 2 weeks of narration. It was like the purest kind of filmmaking. You know, just a Sennheiser microphone and a Nagra, that's all he had. No operator, it was Stanley pushing the button. That was it. And it was highly, concentrated. So I'd say, well, I've got to stretch my legs, Stanley. He'd say, ping pong. He was always trying to beat me. He never did. Not at ping pong. Chess, another matter. Anyway, so we'd have fun, we'd play, and we'd come back, we'd do another piece. The voiceover works very well. So about, I think, maybe 6 months later, my agent said, oh, by the way, Malcolm, you have 2 weeks of voiceover you haven't been paid for yet. I went, well, I'm going out to see Stanley this afternoon. I'll mention it to him. So as I was leaving, I think I said, oh, by the way, Stanley, my agent informs me that I haven't been paid for the 2 weeks narration. He had a slide rule in his pocket. He took the slide rule out. He went like this, and he went, I'll pay you for a week. I
went, a week? He goes, yep, the other week was ping pong.
Oh, bliss. Bliss and heaven. Oh, it was gorgeousness and gorgeosity made flesh. It was like a bird of rarest spun heaven metal, or like silvery wine flowing in a spaceship, gravity all nonsense now. As I sluiced it, I knew such lovely pictures.
Stanley and Malcolm McDowell got along like a house on fire. Stanley was very happy with the choice of Malcolm, and he delivered spectacularly well.
We became very, very close. I, of course, thought that this was a great friendship and that I expected to be part of his life. And I didn't understand at the time, being a young actor and not having done very many films, so being somewhat inexperienced, that, you know, that the way of a film life is intense relationship, separate. Intense relationship, separate. So I was expecting the relationship to carry on in some form, but he cut it like this. He didn't really want to know. It was over for him. I think the other thing is this. Some of the things that I said about him, which were perhaps unfair, maybe it was a cry out to say, Stanley, pick up the phone and call me. And of course he never did.
I have arranged a little surprise for you.
Surprise?
One that I hope that you will like. As a, how shall we put it? As a symbol of our new understanding. An understanding between two friends.
A Clockwork Orange dealt in part with media exploitation, but now real life imitated art. The film was blamed for many brutal crimes committed by youths claiming to have been inspired by the film's violence. The press and public reaction had a devastating impact on Kubrick and his family.
The attack on Clockwork Orange was fierce in Britain. It was unbelievable. He was directly accused of murder and mayhem. And then every crime in England was because of Clockwork Orange.
Stanley was accused of inciting violence, and I mean, yeah, it became very, very ugly. He got terrible letters, almost death threats. In fact, there were some death threats.
He asked Warner's, can you please help me? I can't live here if this keeps going on. I'm afraid to send my children to school. My house is besieged. I don't know what to do. I don't want to show the film anymore.
A Clockwork Orange had been playing successfully for 61 weeks, but continuing press attacks and repeated threats of violence against him and his family drove Kubrick to withdraw the film from British cinemas. It was an astonishing display of director power.
What came over to us was that a filmmaker should have have the kind of power that he had to be able to do it. Because I think there's no other filmmaker, actually, who could ever stop any studio distributing their film, because studios are about making money. So for him to be able to have the power to do that was always astonishing to us. Particularly, I remember me as a young filmmaker thinking, it's extraordinary that someone could do that. But more than that is that actually that he had the will to do it.
It hurt him financially, but he didn't care about that. And it hurt Warner Brothers even more financially, but they obliged, because it wasn't worth it to them. Having peace with Stanley and making more films with Stanley and having Stanley under contract for the rest of his life, that was much more important to Warner Brothers than whether the Clockwork Orange plays in England or not.
For the release of A Clockwork Orange, Kubrick went way beyond the role of a director, persuading Warner Brothers to adopt his ideas about how the film should be sold to the public.
If you've taken all the trouble with pre-production, with the shooting, with the post-production, and all the trying to get the film together and to, approach it in so many different ways. I mean, why do you not be a part of it just when the public's going to see it?
If I'm not incorrect, Clockwork Orange was the second largest grossing film in the history of Warner's after My Fair Lady. And I used to meet with the foreign distribution guys and say, well, wait a minute. What we're doing here is following Stanley's instruction, and we're getting a remarkable result. We're grossing huge numbers on a picture that you predicted would be a catastrophe because it was so inaccessible. Is it not possible that he knows something that we don't know? Is it not possible that doing it his way is a better way? Or no, he doesn't know. He's just a pain in the ass.
Kubrick had a unique relationship with Warner Brothers, enjoying complete creative control and at the same time the support of a major Hollywood studio.
We all envied that more than anything, I think, over here. The fact that one studio would actually support an artist in that way is quite extraordinary.
For us, it was a question of wanting to work with a master, of wanting to do the movies of Stanley Kubrick. And there weren't runaway costs. It was always overblown and overestimated because he shot films for long periods of time. But he did them at such low cost. You'd walk on a Kubrick set, which was almost never allowed, I might add, and you'd marvel at the fact that there was hardly anyone there. I mean, compared to most movies, it'd be crowds. It'd be people standing around with donuts and passing coffee and people coming and going. So I saw it as an absolute priority. It was something that we were going to focus our attention on, and that was to continue to nurture the relationship and to enhance the relationship.
He was obviously always a step ahead of me, and he called me once. I remember I was at Warner's, and he said, I think it was around the time he was getting ready to do Linden. And he said, do you have any of those special BNC cameras that we used for rear process? I said, why? He said, well, I sort of sentimental reasons I started out on them. I'd love to buy one from you if I could get one. So I called the camera department and I said, do you have any of those? And they said, yeah, we've got a couple of those. I called Stanley back. I said, yeah, I've got a couple. He said, I'd love to get those cameras. I mean, I just, admire the workmanship. So I said, great. So I sent him off one of those, or maybe two of them, I can't remember. About 6 months later, Gottschalk, who ran Panavision for us, and who was a sort of certified camera and opticals genius, called and said, why are you sending those rear projection cameras to Stanley Kubrick? I said, because he asked for them. I mean, they sit down there. We don't use rear projection anymore. We're doing front projection. He said, they're priceless. They are the most fantastic works that were ever put in a camera. They are brilliantly conceived and brilliantly executed camera works. You could never build a camera like that if your life depended on it. He said, I want to get everyone I can because I can't duplicate the work that went into it. Stanley had anticipated it and acquired them and built his own cameras.
He looked for old-fashioned Mitchell BNC cameras for a very specific reason. These were the only cameras, to his knowledge, where he had a chance of fitting these big Zeiss lenses.
And Stanley sent me this lens and said, could I mount it on his BNC camera? I said, Stanley, it's absolutely impossible because the BNC has 2 shutters, a thick aperture plate, and all that between the film plane and the rear element of the lens. And so I explained that to Stanley and said we would have to damn near wreck your camera and make it purely dedicated to do this. And he said, fine, go ahead and do it. It originally was a lens manufactured, designed, developed, and manufactured by Zeiss for NASA. And of course, NASA was planned to use it in satellite photography. And for that reason, it's an extremely fast lens. It's an f/0.7, which is 2 stops faster than the fastest lenses that are available even today. Of course, Stanley's intention for these lenses was to shoot the famous candlelit scenes in Barry Lyndon, and that being the case, he shot with the lenses wide open, f/0.7, and as a consequence of that, he had practically no depth of field at all. And it was quite a chore to do it, but of course, the images were absolutely gorgeous.
think Stanley would have a concept of wanting to do something in a way that had never been achieved before, that he wanted to put himself into that century and with these characters and these settings and give you a way of seeing them as they would have been seen at the time that book was written. Yet he was using the most extraordinarily modern instruments and daring instruments, but the fact that he used these candles, and yes, and that's part of it, but also just the interiors, just the way sunlight came into rooms. It was to achieve the presence in a period in a way that I don't think anybody had ever done it before.
I knew it was a costume piece, but I had hoped he was going to take the costume, quote, costume piece somewhere else, and he took it back in time. And the use of the zoom lens is very interesting because you would never do, who would think? Use a zoom lens in the past, never. No, the zoom lens flattens it out like 18th century painting. And the movement, the body language, and the use of music, and again, the editing of the film, how transporting that moment is when Ryan O'Neal gives a wonderful performance and Marissa Berenson as he meets her for the first time, kissing her on the balcony with the music and how his body moves.
Stanley did not want the film to look like one of those traditional movies where period clothes look like wardrobes. He wanted the clothes to move, he wanted the clothes to have life, and he wanted to do something which was very reminiscent of certain painters of that period. Stanley sent me to all kinds of auction houses were dealing with period costumes. So we were mixing some period costumes. So Stanley wanted beautiful materials because, as he quite rightly said, that's why in those paintings they give those wonderful lights. And everybody keeps talking about Lindo still now as one of the most beautiful 18th century movies. But it's because of the way he shot it, the way he pushed us to do our work.
You know, as an artist, you very often instinctively design, you know, and to intellectually justify your creativity is very difficult. And I think the same applies to actors. Though he knew and respected, I'm sure, the actors, he would permutate their performances almost to breaking point.
I remember going on the set one day and there were like 1,000 candles burning. And outside there was a huge storm. And there were these men standing outside. And because of the storm, they had to hold the big lamps. And there was a huge gale in Dublin and the rain was pouring. And it was icy cold. I thought, poor guys, hope they don't have to do it too long. And then the candles are burning down very gradually. And Stan is just sitting there with Hardy Kruger discussing the problem that Hardy had. And he's just saying, well, Hardy, I think we should do it, because, you know, Hardy Kruger, I think, was getting also in the state. So it was interesting, never getting flustered, never raising his voice.
Well, he was wonderful working with actors because it was just one-to-one. You know, you had a relationship with the director. And if he was working in any detail on a role with an actor, well, you know, the others were there, sure. But it was just you and him.
What is your call, Lord Willingdon?
Heads.
It is heads. And Lord Bullingdon will have the first fire. Lord Bullingdon, will you take your ground?
And it was the fact that Stanley was so open and so engaging. When I asked him a question, you know, it might be about the lighting, it might be about the camera, the lenses, he would just take the trouble to speak about it and talk about it in a really, well, detailed way so that I understood what was happening. And that's what really stimulated me and interested me. I mean, for instance, you know, if he came onto the floor, he didn't know how to shoot a scene. I mean, he wasn't sure how he was going to do it. And I also, as an actor, I found that stimulating because what he was saying to me was, you know, do whatever it is you think you're going to do, you know, but do it for real, because that may change the way I'm thinking about the scene.
Sir Richard, this pistol must be faulty. I must have another one.
I'm sorry, Lord Bullingdon, but you must first stand your ground and allow Mr. Linden his turn to fire.
I always felt Stanley was a filmmaker most appreciated by his fellow filmmakers. Critics were always looking for something that wasn't in the movie, and then they were disappointed. And I suppose, in a way, I think that's a little bit Stanley's fault. For example, Barry Lyndon. I mean, I think everybody was expecting a kind of raucous Tom Jones kind of a movie. And you realize, as you look at the movie, that it's really about this slightly dim, handsome boy trying to find the clues and the cues to what's the right behavior, what's the behavior that's going to advance me in this society. So it's a movie really about a young man defining himself in a climate that's foreign to him. And that's not at all what people were led to believe this movie was about.
Barry Lyndon was released just as Hollywood entered the age of the blockbuster action movie. With a running time of nearly 3 hours, the film came in for heavy criticism and was labeled as tedious and boring by most critics in America and Britain. But in Europe, it was hailed as a film of breathtaking beauty.
And remember, it won 4 Oscars. I mean, cinematography, production design, costume design, and the music. But I think, you know, Stanley was disappointed because, well, in the end, it wasn't a commercial success.
He was very, very, very sad and disheartened that particularly smaller papers and smaller television stations did not at all appreciate the tremendous effort that went into these films and, you know, just simply dismissed it.
Whatever movies Stanley made, what I love about his work is they are completely conscious. You may like them, you may not like them, you may say, well, what about this, that, or the other thing? But, you know, everybody pretty much acknowledges he's the man. And I still feel that underrates him.
Kubrick's next project looked far more commercial. With Stephen King's best-selling novel, The Shining, he seized the chance to make a film that would both satisfy him artistically and meet the demands of the box office.
I'm asking about The Shining, you know, it's such unusual. He says, well, in reality, this is an optimistic picture. And I said, on what basis, Stanley? And he said, as the existential, pragmatic man that he was, he said, well, in some way, this movie's about ghosts. Anything that says there's anything after death is an optimistic story.
There are still images in The Shining that I wake up screaming about. That little boy in the hall and the
tracking of the Steadicam.
The little boy on the bicycle.
Of the little boy.
The sense of movement that gave that picture inside this very, very foreboding place.
You know that something is building up in this place, and the way it's the blandness, let's say, of the people, how quiet they are. And
is Tony the one that tells you things?
Yes.
How does he tell you things?
like I go to sleep, and he shows me things. But when I wake up, I can't remember everything.
Has Tony ever told you anything about this place? About the Overlook Hotel?
It's holding back this extraordinarily emotional, powerful, dramatic punch that's going to happen. You know it's going to come somehow and at some time. And it just creates such suspense.
Is there something bad here?
At first, I was taken aback by some of the performance. And then, after the third or fourth viewing, I understood the level of intensity what Nicholson was doing.
I'm not sure that that is intended to be what a typical horror movie is, which is a realistic portrayal of supernatural spookiness. I think that what's going on in that movie is largely going on in Jack Nicholson's head.
Hi, Lloyd. A little slow tonight, isn't it?
Yes, it is, Mr. Torrance.
You know, I like the kind of film he makes. I don't need to be naturalistic in a film to feel satisfied as an actor. You know, one of the things he said to me that I've always remembered was in movies, you don't try and photograph the reality. You try and photograph the photograph of the reality. And I knew it wouldn't be a performance about idiosyncratic behaviorism, but that it would be, I always thought of it as balletic in The Shining. Like another lesson was, here, Jack, the script says Jack is not writing. Well, the question is, what is he doing? And I said, well, you know, whenever I'm inside a big empty place that you normally wouldn't be alone in, I always think of doing things that I might do outside, and that's where throwing that tennis ball all during the picture, and you know, it wound up being a big part of staging. It rolls into things, it's thrown the length of hallways, you know, all of those kinds of things, and it's from those little things that he would develop sort of preconceived idiosyncrasy, you know. I mean, he always knew what he was going to get. He said often that every scene really has been done. Our job is always to do it just a little bit better.
Mr. Grady, you were the caretaker here. I'm sorry to differ with you, sir. But you are the caretaker. You've always been the caretaker. I should know, sir. I've always been here.
We had a good friendly relationship, you know. I mean, he'd turn on you in a moment and say, all right, you know, you're the big fella, let's see it. You know, I mean, that's about as harsh as he ever got with me. You know, I mean, he was a completely different director with Shelley.
Right. Oh, come on. What do you mean, roll
2
video?
seconds.
We're f***ing killing ourselves out here, and you've got to be ready.
I am too. I'm standing
Should we
right
play
by
mood
the
music?
door. No, I
Yeah,
can't
but when you
hear.
came in like this, you said just
We're sitting there because they say, wait a minute, and then you say on the radio,
but when you
go.
do it, you've got to look desperate, Shelley. You're just wasting everybody's time there.
I can't even get
Well,
this
bang
door
against
open.
it.
For a person so charming and so likable, indeed lovable, he can do some pretty cruel things when you're filming. Because it seemed to me at times that the end justified the means.
Here's Johnny.
It was a very difficult role. It was a long shoot, and I had to cry and hyperventilate and carry a little boy and run, you know, for most of the time we shot. And that was about a year, a little over a year. And anywhere between 30 and 50 videotaped rehearsals before we even rolled film. I wouldn't trade the experience for anything. Why? Because of Stanley. And it was a fascinating learning experience. It was such intense work that I think it makes you smarter, but I wouldn't want to go through it again.
We were working with the material that was in the book and trying to make music that fit the mood of a sort of updated Gothic horror story, which is what The Shining is, really. I mean, as a novel in any case. And of course, the stylization that came out through the filming was not present in the book. And so we failed in our attempt, which is why there is a great deal of other music put into the movie.
Danny, you win. Let's take the rest of this walking, huh?
A lot of the music cues are combinations of some of Ligeti's music, some of Penderecki's music. And lots of background patterns and textures with heartbeats and sizzling electronic little weird sounds. And those were all mixed together. That's how Stanley finally did what he was looking for.
When The Shining was released, the response was mixed. Some people appreciated its riddles and ambiguities. Others felt that Kubrick had strayed too far from Stephen King's book.
When I say that the people who love Stanley's movies were mostly movie people, they're just looking at what's in the frame. What's the moviness of the movie? They, of course, love Stanley in a very, I find, in a very uncomplicated way. Whereas, you know, the critical community tends to fuss and fidget over what Stanley did.
After The Shining, Kubrick and his family moved to a large, rambling mansion in the Hertfordshire countryside. Except when filming on location, he would now do all his work here, supported by a small and dedicated team.
The joke line we had about Stanley was, and this was the line you would never ever hear from Stanley, was, don't bother me with the details. I've got complete faith and trust in your judgment. Stanley would involve himself, I mean, to such an extent with the detail of stuff that one thought perhaps was a bit beneath him. He should have been doing major stuff and not worrying about how you had certain files in your office. I guess Stanley saw it all as a package deal. You either cared or you didn't care.
When we went to Ireland on Barry Lyndon, he left this 15-page document, care instructions for how to look after the animals. And the 37th instruction is, if a fight should develop between Freddie and Leo, and that was a father and son tomcats that we had, the only way that you can do anything about it is to dump water on them. Try to grab Freddie and run out of the room with him. Do not try and pick up Leo. Alternatively, if you open a door and just let Freddie get out, he can outrun Leo. But if he's trapped in a place where you can't separate them, just keep dumping water, shouting, screaming, jumping up and down and distracting him, waving shirts, towels. Just try and get them apart and grab Freddie.
I remember once he had a cat that was drinking excessively, and I said, well, perhaps you can measure how much that cat's drinking, Stanley. And he said, no, that's impossible. There are too many cats. And then he phoned back a couple of minutes later and he said, but I could count the number of laps. And he then said, now, how much does each lap take up in terms of water? I said, I don't think there's any information on that. He said, well, leave it with me. I'll try and find out. And he'd go off and he'd try and find out from somewhere, and then he'd work it out and we'd have a figure. You know, he was compulsive in that sort of way.
He was a kind of ultimate Jewish mother. If an animal was ill, or if one of us were ill, I mean, Stanley was like Superman.
I was very, very ill myself for quite a while, and he was so sweet, so kind, so loyal. I mean, everything you want somebody to be, you know, he was. I mean, he was really, really kind. However, I mean, when you weren't ill, that's when you bought it.
He very seldom praised you because he had this obsession
that if he praised you, you would fall to pieces and not do the job right. He knew how far he could push you. That was the other clever thing. Occasionally he pushed you a bit too far, and then he was a bit confused why you were really angry.
Philosophically, he was just no nonsense. You know, honest, had his view, very cool view of humanity. He was a warm guy at home. I mean, I'm sure everybody says that, crazy about animals, and, you know, but could be brutal with people that he worked with. You know, I mean, he wasn't all that way. I mean, sometimes he could be generous as well, but you know, he felt everybody was an opponent. You know, no matter what, he wasn't sure didn't have an agenda of their own, and he wasn't gonna have that on his pictures.
I'm asking the fucking questions here, Private. Do you understand? Sir, yes, sir. Well, thank you very much. Can I be in charge for a while? Sir, yes, sir. Are you shook up? Are you nervous? Sir, I am, sir. Do I make you nervous? Sir. Sir, what? Are you about to call me an asshole?
Full Metal Jacket was based on a novel, The Short Timers, by Gustav Hosford, a Vietnam veteran. He collaborated on the screenplay with Kubrick and Michael Herr, who had covered the war as a correspondent.
He was thinking about making a war movie. And I said, well, Stanley, you already made Paths of Glory. And he said, well, people think of that as an anti-war movie. I want to make a war movie, just to consider the subject, you know, without a moral position or a political position, but as a phenomena.
Holy shit, that's never gonna
And what he ended up doing in Full Metal Jacket, he had the detachment of the view. It's like a God's eye view of combat in the second half of the film. It seems to be so still and removed. The cleanliness of it, and the power of it. And the beauty of it, because it was all so beautifully filmed. And he understood that it was accepted, that it was quite okay to acknowledge that among all the things that war is, it's also very beautiful.
It's the only film that's ever done that, to give you a real idea of what it's like, and also what the kids have got to go through, and how important a drill sergeant is.
Oh, that's right, Private Pyle. Don't make any fucking effort to get up to the top of the fucking obstacle. If God wanted you up there, he would have miracled your ass up there by now, wouldn't he? Sir, yes, sir. Get your fat ass up there, Pyle.
And also the nature of the tragedy of it.
What is your major malfunction, numbnuts? Didn't Mommy and Daddy show you enough attention when you were a child?
Easy, Leonard. Go easy, man.
And then the whole movie changes and moves out. And I see it was interesting too about Kubrick is that the structure is all, he doesn't deal with traditional dramatic structure, which is good. He was experimenting.
looks like something, doesn't it?
Yeah.
You know, for a director who's perceived as being of, you know, completely uptight and controlling, and he was very free-form, Stanley. You know, he'd try anything. He'd ask the actors in for long meetings and say there's no such thing as a stupid idea in this context. If you have an idea, just say it, you know, and he'd often adopt them. I'm not saying Stanley wasn't a control freak. I would never say that. But there were many ways in which he was not controlling.
Should probably not be, should be more frightened and then get into that. Do something brilliant.
I loved him. I enjoyed his sense of humor, but I would be lying if I didn't say that there were times when he was incredibly difficult. If you weren't willing to solve the problem as much as he was trying to solve it, if you weren't, you know, as devoted to understanding what it was that he was trying to go after, it was really hard for him. And I think that the thing was sometimes you didn't know what it was that he was looking for. You know, I remember walking around Beckton Gas Works and stumbling around by myself, and Stanley drove up in the Jeep, and he said, you know, what's wrong? Why are you walking around? I said, I don't know. I don't know what it is that you want from me. And he said, are you crazy? He said, get in the Jeep. He says, I'm not. I don't want you to do anything. I want you just to be yourself. That's all I want.
You write Born to Kill on your helmet, and you wear a peace button. What's that supposed to be, some kind of sick joke?
No, sir.
What is it supposed to mean?
I don't know, sir.
You don't know very much, do you?
No, sir.
You better get your head and your ass wired together, or I will take a giant shit on you.
Yes, sir.
Now answer my question, or you'll be standing tall before the man.
I think I was trying to suggest something about the duality of man, sir.
The what?
The duality of man, the Jungian thing, sir.
Whose side are you on, son?
Kubrick shot part of Full Metal Jacket in East London, where a derelict gasworks was transformed into the bombed-out city of Hue, Vietnam.
The four key elements were the demolition, the signage, palm trees, and the smoke. And most of this was shot magic hour. Magic hour, it is that delightful time of the day when you're all exhausted and the light is perfect.
All right.
He's dead.
You impart what you know and collaborate very much with Stanley. It's not easy to impress him with what you do, but the fact of the day, if you come out not ticking off about something, you know you've done pretty well. You get very close. You're part of the family, and it's a unit that works very close, hand in glove, because you're there 24 hours a day, sometimes with him, and you eat, drink, and sleep it. There's no life outside of film with Stanley, and if you enjoy it, there's no greater experience in my mind.
Everybody earned their pay when they worked for Stanley. But nobody earned their pay the way Stanley earned his pay. No one worked as thoroughly, deeply, obsessively as Stanley did. And he understood that when you're making a movie, you often don't know what it is you want until you see it.
Should we try it? Let's give it a crack.
One way or another, I felt utterly compensated for my time with Stanley. You know, if you're in it only for the money, you might have a different feeling about it. But my feeling was that, you know, I have absolutely no complaints.
Kubrick had started work on the idea for Full Metal Jacket in 1980. When the film was released 7 years later, several Vietnam movies had already reached the screen. Kubrick, the great innovator, had been overtaken by other filmmakers. But Full Metal Jacket still appealed to a wide audience because it bore all the distinctive hallmarks of a Stanley Kubrick film.
He didn't ever like the fact that he made so few films. He always wished he could have done more. And if he had anything negative in his life, I think it was that feeling that he was slow.
I suppose the other thing I noted about Stanley was that there were still magnificent obsessions that he had that he never quite realized. His fascination with the Second World War and with the movie industry and Goebbels during that period.
For years, Kubrick had tried to find a way of portraying the appalling inhumanity of the Holocaust on screen. Now he turned Louis Begley's book, Wartime Lies, into Aryan Papers, the story of a Jewish family in Poland trying to evade capture by the Nazis. By the time he was ready to go into production, Steven Spielberg had begun shooting Schindler's List. Feeling the similarities were too great, Kubrick reluctantly shelved Aryan Papers.
There was another thing that he felt it just couldn't be told. If I really want to show what I have read and know happened, and he read everything, how can I even film it? How can you even pretend it? He became very depressed during the preparations, and I was glad when he gave up on it, because it was really taking its toll.
Now Kubrick turned his attention to another long-standing project, based on a short story by Brian Aldiss. But AI evolved into such a mammoth undertaking that Kubrick eventually sought the collaboration of another director.
He said, you know, you really ought to direct AI and I should produce it for you. And I was shocked. I said, yeah, right. He said, no, I'm serious. He said, it'll be great. It'll be a Stanley Kubrick production of a Steven Spielberg film. I remember him actually, you know, giving me a title card on the whole proposal. And I said, why would you want to do that, Stanley? Because this was something I knew he had been developing from his heart for so long and had contributed so many elements beyond Brian's original, short story. And Stanley just said, well, you know, I think it's this movie is closer to your sensibility than mine. And he was so insistent, in fact, he said, when can you come out here and talk to me about this in person? And I said, well, when would you like me to come out here? He said, tomorrow morning. I was on Long Island. It was during the summer. So I got on an airplane the next day and I flew to his kitchen. And we, for the first time, sat down and he said, I'm going to show you these storyboards. And he started to show me a plethora of work that he had done on this picture.
It was a project which needed a lot of special effects, and he eventually postponed the project for technical reasons. Computer technology was about to explode, and he figured he would benefit enormously by waiting a few years. So the next project became Eyes Wide Shut.
When Eyes Wide Shut was announced as Kubrick's next film, celebrity columnists focused on the mysterious director who had not made a film or given an interview for over 10 years. They rehashed old stories, which Kubrick had never bothered to deny.
He'd been pegged. Reclusive filmmaker, probably half mad. For a man to whom I think control was everything, the notion that he could not, in the last analysis, control this image that had grown up about who he was, it must have brought him to a sort of a kind of despair, and it's sort of like, oh, the hell with it. You know, if that's what they want to think, that's what they'll think, and I can't do anything about it.
He dealt with it the way he had to deal with it. I knew it was rubbish, and that was all that mattered to me. And it mostly was all that mattered to him, although the more disgusting things did upset him, and he would talk about that sometimes. But I know until the end of Eyes Wide Shut had started to say, right, well, now I'm going to do a few proper interviews and try and set the record a little straighter.
Yeah, he didn't want to be somebody who shoots tourists on his lawn and then gives them money when they bleed. But it also, because it's another thing that fits into, you know, the nerdy monster sliming around in his house and hating women. I mean, he's surrounded by them. I think there are few men who knew as much about women as he did.
It's impossible for me to just be objective and say, well, he should have spoken up, he should have been more gregarious. Well, you know, he couldn't, he wasn't. Why should he?
He also had a great nerve. He would open the door to somebody who was looking for Stanley Kubrick, and he said he's not at home. Because for a long time, nobody knew what his face looked like.
He was very, very knowledgeable about things, Stanley. Deeply curious and interested in the world, which I think a lot of people aren't aware about that. They think for someone so obsessive and so committed to what he does, that the rest of the world might pass him by. But of course, as we all know, he funneled the world into his life, into his kitchen.
Well, here was a man who set up his life so that he was warmed constantly by his family and by his circle of friends, who worked in a situation where he was a matter of minutes from the place that he worked. You know, who among us would be anything but envious of the way he's managed to set up his life?
The book is a tract about, you know, what are the dangers of married life? What are the silent desperations of keeping an ongoing relationship alive? And what are the choices? You know, you're either in that or you're not in that. And Stanley was very, very much a family man and in it. And the conjectures that he made about what it might be like outside it had a lot to do with what he was curious about.
It was a theme that we both talked about a great deal. And he thought about it in many different ways. It used to come back over the years again and again. And as you see friends getting divorced and remarried, and the topic would come up again. And it had so many variations and so much really serious thought to it that he knew one day he was going to make it.
May I ask why a beautiful woman, who could have any man in this room, wants to be married?
Why wouldn't she?
Is it as bad as that?
As good as that.
Stanley's expectations of people were not really, really high. And you see it in his films. And there was human beings that he loved. I mean, Christiane was the love of his life. And he would talk about her with, I mean, he adored her. And that's something that people didn't know. His daughters adored them. And I would see that because he would talk to me about them very proudly. But his understanding of humans was that we are very bittersweet. But he admired, I think, like passion and commitment and loyalty. I mean, because ultimately Eyes Wide Shut is about that commitment. It's a very hopeful film. People see it as a very dark film, but it's not. It's very hopeful.
Alice, I must see you again.
That's impossible.
Why?
Because I'm married.
His films are often thought to be without pity. That's a good quality, it seems to me, because he's saying to us, we are like this. We are hopeless, muddled, fallible, desperate, needing love human beings. And in the end, I think that's what is the central quality of his films. He tells us about human beings as we are, not as we'd like to imagine that we are.
The heart of it was illustrating a truth about relationships and sexuality, but it was not illustrated in a literal way, but in a theatrical way.
People said, well, the streets don't look like New York. I said, well, in a way, I said, it doesn't matter. Look at the name of the street. I said, no such street exists in New York. I said, in a funny way, it's as if you're experiencing New York in a dream, It seems like New York, but it's not. It seems like your wife, But what is she telling me? And do I want to know? Maybe I shouldn't ask.
Because I'm a beautiful woman, the only reason any man ever wants to talk to me is because he wants to fuck me? Is that what you're saying?
Well, I don't think it's quite that black and white, but I think we both know what men are like.
So on that basis, I should conclude that you wanted to fuck those two models.
There are exceptions.
What makes you an exception?
I took that character of Bill home with me. And at times that was not a nice place to be sitting in that character for that amount of time. It really is not the kind of person that I am, that contained, non-communicative, likes the daily routine, the stability of his life, just, ignoring his wife in that relationship and just not wanting to rock the boat. Taking things for granted, Bill did. Took her for granted, took his family for granted, his life for granted. It's just a little too smug, and she just goes, bang.
I first saw him that morning in the lobby. He was checking into the hotel, and he was following the bellboy with his luggage. He glanced at me as he walked past, just a glance. Nothing more. But I could hardly move.
When we went in to rehearse that scene, it was the three of us, and we just kind of got in our underwear and, not Stanley, we got in our underwear. And we just talked about the scene and just kind of didn't really worry about the lines too much at that point. It just slowly evolved. And we were doing take after take. You know, I said, Stanley, what do you want? He said, I want the magic. I want the magic. But then as the scene progressed, as, you know, take after take doing it, you'd feel the scene reach a level and everyone felt, oh, that's acceptable, that's interesting. And then we'd keep working on it and it would feel bad, it was stale, it wasn't working. And then suddenly we could feel it break into a place that none of us had really thought of before.
The whole process of the film was a discovery. It was never about the result. It was never about, well, we have a week to shoot this scene, so quick. We have to do it. Let's see. We may not fully explore it, but we'll get something good. As Stanley wanted to explore every avenue and then make his decisions based on that. And Stanley was not restricted by time. He refused to be. And that is a great luxury that only somebody like he could afford because of what he'd achieved through his career, to be able to say, do you want to know what's gold with filmmaking? Time is gold. Not having to walk away from a scene before you feel like you really perfected it.
And I wanted to make fun of you. To laugh in your face. And so I laughed as loud as I could. And that must have been when you woke me up.
And the other thing Stanley hated doing was ever explaining himself. So what's the film about, Stanley? He'd look down and look away and not answer. And the same thing applied to a scene. So what do you really want this scene to be? He would never answer that.
Eyes Wide Shut seems to be a rake's progress story. He goes on an adventure that could really turn out any way, and it's a sort of an irresponsible adventure for him to embark on. But it's a fantasy, isn't it? It's a dream film. I don't think we're supposed to believe anything that we see. And I think that one thing that people do have a hard time with in the cinema is ambiguity. Ambiguity is great, but in the cinema it's almost verboten.
In a way, perhaps the most extraordinary example of how a piece of music is used to drive home something about character and story and atmosphere of a film is in Eyes Wide Shut.
Please, come forward.
I was in Stalinist, terroristic Hungary, where this kind of music was not allowed. And I just wrote it for myself. Stanley Kubrick understood the dramatism of this moment, and this is what he did in the film. And for me, when I composed it in the year 50, in Budapest, desperately, it was a knife in
Stanley's heart. He had that director's disease of really imagining the easy part of it until you get there, you know. I'm sure he did not go into Eyes Wide Shut expecting to shoot for 14 months. But I must say, I thought the same thing. I said, well, I'll be out of here in 3 days. The first scene we did in 2 hours or something that night at the house where they come in and I just say hello. And so I said, well, what are all these things I hear about? It's going to take forever. I went there, and 3 hours later, I was back at the hotel in London. This is going to be a snap.
I remember even him teasing me, saying, "What are you doing, Cruz?" I said, "I know, it's great having you here, Sidney. You're perfect, you're just fantastic," because we shot it in a day.
And then,
of course, the next day, Sidney comes out, and he's dressed. He's got his sleeves up. He's in his pants. He knows every line of this massive, scene there. And he says, "Come on, let's run lines. Let's go, Tom. Let's go, Cruz. Let's go. I gotta go. I got a week, and again, we're gonna jam this out, and I'm gonna, it's gonna be fantastic." And we're doing the Steadicam shot of me coming into the room, And so Sidney goes, "Look, all right, how do you want me to do this?" And Stanley said, "Well, I don't know, let's try it and see." He says, "Well, I can go to the door fast." "Okay, well, let's see what that's like." He says, "Okay, now open the door." And then he says, "Well, maybe that's a little too fast." "Okay, I can go slower. I can go slower." So we start doing the scene this way.
By the third week, when we're in the billiard room, I'm saying, my God, how?
Of course, said Stanley, said, "Well, Sidney, I mean, I didn't think it would be much longer than that, but don't you want to get it right?"
I tell you, there are a lot of people in our business who are, well, they label themselves perfectionists. That's a kind of a euphemism for a pain in the ass, really. Stanley was the first real perfectionist that I met. I mean, there just wasn't any way for him to go one take less, or he never gave an inch on anything.
So much was expected of him every time. He wasn't allowed just to make a movie. It had to be an amazing movie, because so many of us actually were waiting for the next Stanley Kubrick film. So it had to be an event. And I think on his shoulders, therefore, was a terrible responsibility in a way.
When Eyes Wide Shut was finally shown for the very first time in New York on March 1st, 1999, to Tom and Nicole and the heads of the studio, the response was very enthusiastic. Stanley was very, very happy, and a great heavy weight was lifted from his shoulders. I think this change of his being caused almost a physical change in his body, because he had lived with this enormous responsibility for a very expensive film, which was long in the shooting for a long time, for 2 years, and suddenly it was all gone. He died a week later.
The enormous intensity that Stanley had with his work, he also applied to his family. And I always felt very much loved, and so did the children. And he was consistent in that he always said, either you care or you don't.
Well, Stanley was always a man who never wanted to repeat himself. He reinvented himself with every single motion picture he directed. As a filmmaker, for me, he was a conceptual illustrator of the human condition.
You say, well, gee, I wish he'd made more, but these were enough. Because there's so much in each one. There's so much in it. Yeah, it would have been nice for him to make more. But that's not the process. That wasn't his process. And what he did make was something that's so special and unique, it's like a different movie every time you see it.
I think as a director, I think that what we all admired the most was that it was a single vision. It was one man's vision. And no one interfered with that vision, and the complete control that he had in the making of his films, that meant that whatever it had in the back of his head was up there on the screen. And I know that he struggled a lot to get to that place. I think it's something that all of us actually have benefited from.
Two major artists were Orson Welles and Stanley in terms of being, you know, genuine, no-holds-barred artists. You know, so I would put him in the pantheon of the absolute top film directors that the world has seen.
And was one of the people that sort of knew what was wrong with the world in a weird way and was able to turn that into art. He just didn't grouse about it or bitch or write lousy editorials. He converted it into something that was amazing and important for us as a species.
I always thought I'd work with Stanley again. You know, we kept in touch over the years and everything and talked about other projects. And it's a sad thing that I won't have that great opportunity.
I miss him. How could one not miss him?
He was a man who is completely unique. He's a man I loved and admired. With all the difficulties he had with him. He was not an easy person. It didn't matter. I mean, you know, obviously I worked with him for 30 years for good reasons.
Stanley is gone. There's never going to be another Kubrick film. You will never have a film that will look like this ever again because it is Stanley. And he pushed everyone to the limit. He pushed the film to the limit. He pushed, you know, the actors emotionally, but because we all wanted to go there with him.
Part of Stanley's legacy on my life is that, well, you believe in something, you passionately believe in something, so devote yourself to it completely, utterly, and don't apologize for doing it.
He felt extremely lucky to be in a situation where he could tell stories on such a large scale and millions of dollars involved. I think when he was young, he didn't dare hope he would be able to do that. I don't think he ever took that for granted. And he would often say to people, you know, say, how are you doing, Stan? He said, I'm still fooling them.